Hello, I'm Graham and I hope everyone's having a great day. Welcome to part 4 of my user's guide to the Panasonic Lumix FZ2000 or 2500 bridge camera. Now, for clarity's sake, I'm just going to call this the FZ2000 in this video. Now, in the previous video, we looked at shooting in the semi-automatic modes of program auto, aperture priority and shutter priority. And I think I proved within that video that it doesn't really matter how you achieve the exposure. They're all going to give you the same result. So if you've got a 1/25th at f8 at ISO 125, it doesn't matter whether you've shot that in the program auto mode or in the aperture priority mode or the shutter priority mode, the result will be the same image. Now, it can be said the same for shooting in today's topic, which is going to be the manual mode. Now, if you look at some camera magazines and textbooks, it says that you're not a photographer unless you can use the manual mode. Well, I tend to disagree with that statement because effectively photography is about three component parts. One is the ISO, which controls the sensitivity of the camera to light. We've got the aperture, which governs the amount of depth of field we create in our image. And we've got shutter speed, which governs the amount of subject motion blur, and that can be used creatively to create motion blur, such as in running water and silky waterfalls, or you can use it to stop action, such as sports photography. Ideally, if you lock down the ISO to the lowest ISO of the camera to give you the best dynamic range and lowest noise, you end up with just the effect of aperture and shutter speed to vary to get your exposure. So if you are shooting in the manual mode, you've got control of aperture, shutter speed and ISO. There is no exposure value compensation, the same as we have in the program auto modes or aperture or shutter priority. There's no dial you can move to increase or decrease the brightness if the camera metering circuit hasn't got it correct. It means that you either have to change your ISO or your shutter speed or your aperture to get the exposure right. And in that case, you might even miss the shot that you're wanting to take. Whereas in one of the semi-automatic modes, having dialed in an aperture, if you're in aperture priority mode and locked down the ISO, the camera will automatically change the shutter speed for you. And if the metering isn't correct, you can use your front control dial, if you program that for exposure value compensation, to very quickly bring that back to the normal exposure that you need. And then take the shot. It's very intuitive, very fast, and you get the shot you want. In manual mode, you might have to think about it. Do I need to change the aperture because I've set that for a depth of field? Do I want to change the shutter speed? No, because I've set that for a particular shutter speed to arrest some motion. So it means I've got to then fiddle to change the ISO to get that exposure correct. So it's a more deliberate process and more probably suited for indoors like tabletop studio photography, where you've got the time and luxury to be able to mess with the settings to get the right exposure. You can argue outside it's no use for things like street shooting, where you've got to be very quick on the ball to get the exposure right. Even transient situations are difficult to capture in the manual mode. Now, having said that, within the manual mode with the FZ2000, there is a facility to set up auto ISO. So it means that if you've set the aperture for the amount of depth of field you want in your shot, and you've set the shutter speed to arrest some motion, say if you're shooting sports, with the auto ISO, if the brightness changes, the camera will automatically change the ISO sensitivity and allow you to get the right exposure. So you don't have to worry about changing ISO to get the exposure right. The camera will do that automatically for you. So that's setting up auto ISO in the ISO setting on your camera. So that's a useful facility. There is a facility in there to limit the amount of ISO the camera will dial in. So you can set the maximum ISO to say 1600, and the camera won't move beyond 1600 if your lighting situation changes and the light situation goes lower. Unfortunately, there's not a minimum shutter speed that the auto ISO can employ. So in the semi-automatic modes, we haven't got the facility, the same as we have with some of the DSLRs, where we can set a minimum shutter speed if you're going to be using auto ISO in something like aperture priority mode. So Panasonic have gone part way to giving us full automation in a manual mode, but not entirely correct yet. In the manual mode, as with the semi-automatic mode, the camera relies very heavily on the metering to get the exposure correct. Now, with the manual mode, you're using the exposure meter to set your exposure correct. So once you've dialed in the aperture you want, once you've dialed in the shutter speed you want, then you're using the ISO to balance the exposure so that the bars on the exposure metering scale are at 0, so you've got perfect exposure. If you wanted to underexpose by 1/3 of a stop to control highlights, then you would set your ISO so you're 1/3 of a stop underneath the 0 point on the exposure meter. Within the metering, we've got whole area, we've got center weighted, and we've got spot. Now, whole area is often called evaluative metering in some of the Canon systems, where it looks at the whole scene and tries to determine what the average brightness would be for the whole scene. So it's, in some respects, a better metering mode than center weighted, which just looks at the central area of the image and tries to control that. Spot metering is really difficult to use unless you're completely au fait with selecting a mid-tone, because that's what the metering circuit is trying to do. It's trying to drive the exposure always to a mid-grey. If you have an 18% grey card, then you can set that into your scene, meter off the grey card, set your camera up in the manual mode using that settings from the back of the camera, and the exposure will be perfect. Alternatively, you can use a handheld light meter, but as you've got a meter in the camera, why not use that in the first instance? So let's set the camera up on a tripod, and you can see the back of the screen when I talk you through some of the issues around using the metering circuit and the control of your depth of field, your subject motion blur, and your noise in the ISO mode. So let's set that up and have a look at what we can achieve. So we'll set the camera up in the manual mode, and of course you do that by turning the mode dial to the M position so that it aligns with the white index mark on the flash housing. So I'm going to turn that round, and again you can see on the screen the M appears, which tells us we're in the manual mode. Now we've got control of aperture, shutter speed and ISO. So by depressing the ISO button, we can then change our ISO setting. If we use the front control dial, we will change the aperture, and if we use the back control dial, we will change the shutter speed. Let's suppose that I want to take this landscape shot that's in front of us here. I would normally want to use an aperture of, say, f5.6, so I'll use the front control dial to turn the aperture to f5.6. Like so. Now I want to set my ISO to 125 because that's the lowest ISO this camera supports, gives me the lowest noise and the highest dynamic range. So if the ISO wasn't set to 125, you'd use the back control dial there now to change to 125. Once you've done that, you can press menu set to go back to the shooting screen. And now I need to balance the exposure. You can see the exposure on the exposure meter here shows we are underexposed. So to correct for that, I would turn the back control dial in the direction which has been indicated by the underexposure. So if it's underexposed, you turn it to the left, and if it's overexposed, you turn the back control dial to the right. So I'm going to turn the back control dial to the left, and you can see that the exposure meter is now moving towards the 0 position. When we're at the 0 position, you'll get plus and minus 0, which means the exposure meter has set that to the correct exposure level. And if we take that picture, you can see the result in the video. And in fact, I'll turn on the self timer so we don't get any camera shake. Now, if I wanted to underexpose that scene slightly to maintain some of the highlights in the clouds above, then I don't have control of exposure value compensation, as I said in the introduction, with any dial. So to do that, I must change either the aperture, the shutter speed, or the ISO. So in this case, if I want to underexpose it, it means I've got to go to a lower ISO, and I can't go to a lower ISO with this camera because ISO 125 is the lowest that it supports. So what I have to do is to change the shutter speed with the back control dial so that it's underexposed. So I'm going to turn that to the right. You now notice I've gone to 1/3 of a stop underexposed, which is what I want for this particular shot. So I've now set up effectively 1/3 exposure value compensation, and we can just take that shot to meter the scene. Now this is derived from our metering circuit. If we just go into the metering, and you'll find that on page 2 of 7, metering mode is now set to the whole area. So the whole area at the moment is giving us that 3/20th of a second to f5.6. If we select the center area, center weighted, it's still giving us a 3/20th at 5.6 because we set that. But if you look at the exposure now, it's showing us we are plus 1/3 EV overexposed. That's because it's looking at the central area and not taking into consideration much of the sky now. So if I was to base the exposure on that, again, I would turn the exposure dial towards the way that the exposure meter is showing me. So I'm going plus, I'm going to the right, which brings me back to 0. Now if I take that shot, it's now taking our exposure up to 1/400th at f5.6. So if we look at that in the video after I post-process it, you'll see we've got a better picture because we've got more detail in the clouds. If we went to spot metering, we'll look at spot metering. The metering is done from that very, very small cross in the middle of the focus area. So to change the position of the spot metering, I'll use the left-hand cursor button and then use the down arrow so that I can position the focus and metering. The metering always moves with the focus square, so once you change position of your focus square, you'll actually change position of the metering. Now if you haven't got a grey car to work on, a good rule of thumb is if you use green grass, that reflects about 18% light as well. So by looking at the exposure now, you can see that it is way, way underexposed. So if I turn the exposure dial in that direction to hit our 0 point, we're now down to 1/100th of a second at f5.6. Now I said in the manual mode we can invoke the auto ISO to allow us to change shutter speed or aperture or have the lighting situation changed, and the camera will make the adjustments for us. So at the moment we're shooting at 1/100th of a second at f5.6 at ISO 125. So I'm going to press the ISO button and select auto ISO. So now when we come back to the shooting screen, we've still got the same exposure, but the camera is now controlling ISO. So if I change my shutter speed, if I go from 1/100th to 200, you notice that the ISO has changed from 125 to 250, which is the same increment, one stop. And if I go to 1/500th, you notice we've gone to ISO 640, which is 2 stops. So the camera is controlling the exposure based on the changes that I've made to either shutter speed or aperture, or if the light has changed. So if I wanted 1/800th of a second to capture a sports scene, then the camera would change the ISO based on the metering circuit result, and it would give me ISO 1000. So I could take that shot and it would be the same exposure as we had with ISO 125 because the camera has changed the ISO to accommodate the change in the shutter speed. Similarly, if I change the aperture, if I went to f8, you notice the camera has changed the ISO to 2000, so it's behaving exactly as you would expect the camera to, and using the exposure triangle to evaluate your new exposure. Now, one of the other controls you can bring into play in the manual mode, in fact you can use it in any of the semi-automatic modes as well, is the highlight and shadow curve. Now this really only affects the outer camera JPEGs, doesn't do anything to your RAW image, but if you're just shooting JPEG or you're shooting JPEG plus RAW and just using the JPEG for the moment, then you can change the contrast of the image. It's almost like changing the photo styles, but you're just doing this particularly to the highlight and shadows. So in the menu you'll find highlight and shadow on page 3 of 7. If you press menu set, it brings you up to the controls which allow you to change the way the tone curve works. So it's going to change the contrast of the image. At the moment we've got a linear contrast between highlight and shadow, so it's showing you a straight line. Now there are some presets built into the camera, and if you scroll along using the navigation button, you can see we've got a increased contrast to +2 and -2. We've got lower contrast, which is highlight -2 and shadow +2, which is opposite to this one, which is higher contrast. So we're increasing the highlights and decreasing the shadows. The one for lower contrast would decrease the highlights and increase the shadows. And if you wanted to just brighten the shadows, we've got the third control, so it pushes the shadows up. Might introduce a little bit of noise depending on how dark those shadows are. Then you've got 3 custom modes that you can program yourself. So if you wanted to set C1 and you wanted to change the shadows, then using the back control dial you can change the curve. So if we wanted to raise the shadows by +3, and we also wanted to lower the highlights by 3, so we've got a stronger contrast, then if I turn the front control dial to the left, you notice now I can change the highlights to -3, and we've got the shadows at +3, so that is a stronger contrast. So it's saying save by using the up arrow button, so use the up arrow and we'll save that in custom 1. It asked me to overwrite the settings, so I'm going to overwrite those settings and it's complete. So now it's using the tone curve, and that's indicated on the screen with the tone curve. So if I take that picture again, you'll notice we've got stronger contrast now because we've set that up. So if I go back to ISO 125 so we can compare that, come back to ISO 125, of course I changed the shutter speed, so I need to change that and turn the back control dial in the direction of the meter scale. So I'm going to bring that back to the 0 point, and we'll change the aperture to f5.6. Again, got to change the shutter speed now back to there. So that would be the same conditions as we had for the first shot, and that will have a stronger contrast than if I just set the tone curve back to 0, which is there. So you may find that useful in your general photography. If you want to have higher or lower contrast, you can use that as a preset in your custom mode. Now, the beauty of the FZ2000 is the fact that we've got inbuilt ND filters. So if we were in bright sunshine and we wanted to use a wide open aperture of say f2.8 in the 24mm position, then we can employ the ND filters to allow us to use that wide open aperture. It goes from 1/4 through 1/16 through 1/64. So at the moment my exposure is correct at 1/80 at 5.6. So if I move the filter to the quarter position, you now notice that the exposure meter is showing me we're underexposed. So I'm going to change the shutter speed to bring that back to the 0 point. So at 1/80th, 1/40th is one stop, and down to a 20th will give me those 2 stops. So that's the quarter. If we went to the 16th setting, which is there, that again has shown me we've got underexposed situation because we're reducing the light reaching the sensor. And again, if I change the exposure, change the shutter speed from 1/20th to 1/10th is 1 stop. From a 10th to a 5th is 2 stops. So we've now gone from 1/80th of a second to 1/5th of a second to give us this exposure. And if I go to a 64th, again, if I go 2 stops with the shutter speed, so I go from a 5th to 2.5, and then from 2.5 to 1.3 gives us our. So each one of those exposures would be the same because we're corrected for the reduction in light by changing our shutter speed. So you can use that to your advantage if you want to create those silky water shots. You can extend your shutter speed by dialing in neutral density, or it allows you to use a wider aperture in bright sunshine. So there we are, that is part 4 of this video tutorial series. I was going to include a video primer in this, but the video is likely to be too long, so I'll do that as a separate video, and it will be a preamble to shooting video with the FZ2000, which are the codecs to use, what the codecs are, best settings to give you some good video productions. So until the next video, thanks again for watching. Of course, if you're a new viewer, please do click that subscribe button and the bell notification icon so you'll be warned when I get the next video up of this series. Also check out my photographic blog, and I will put a link to that in the video description below. On the home page of that blog is the application there to join my 3 weekly newsletter. It's more than a newsletter, it's really a technical publication in its own right. So if you want to sign up for that newsletter, if you've not already done so, just complete the application on the page 1, which gives me the authorization to email you. So until the next video, thanks again for watching, please do take care, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Goodbye for now.